Tonight we have introducing Henry Morford, the greatest Middletown writer you probably never heard of. It's a good time to be holding this. This is actually his 200th anniversary, 200th birthday, I'm sorry, of Henry Morford. So it's interesting that we're holding it during this very month. It's going to be brought to us today by Dr. Stanley Blair, who's been a professor of English at Monmouth University for quite a number of years. And he's taken quite a special interest in local authors. So we're very proud to have Dr. Blair join us. Stanley?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. I'm quite grateful to be able to speak to you today in Middletown on the 200th anniversary of Henry Morford's birth month, which I think is just wonderful. Now, how many of you have heard of Henry Morford prior to this being on the screen? Okay, good. A couple of you. That's great. Okay, so we want to increase that number tonight. So, as Tom said, my talk is entitled Introducing Henry Morford, the greatest Middletown writer you probably never heard of. And so the probably doesn't apply to those of you who just raised your hands. Our subject I'll skip ahead. Our subject this evening is Henry Morford, born 1823, died 1881. He was born, spent most of his first 30 years, published his first book, wrote nonfiction sketches about, and is buried in Middletown. He owned and edited a newspaper, proposed to dedicate his first book of poems to the citizens of, networked with residents of, performed in, and wrote at least 2 novels, apparently set in Monmouth County. If you have ever heard or used the term shoddy, Henry Morford was partly responsible for its current meaning. It's my great honor this month on the 200th anniversary of his birth to be able to share with you some of my ongoing research about his work, life, and times. The main focus of my research so far has been a book of nonfiction sketches he published in 1863. In some of these sketches, he represented what life in Middletown was like in the late 1830s and early 1840s. My main focus tonight is to focus on Morford's life in Middletown Township, and more generally on his connections to other Monmouth County. Also give, at least in some preliminary way, a general sense of him, an overview of his life and works. Additionally, I have been asked by 2 residents to touch on 2 things: the questions of what Morford was best known for as a writer. Wrote any works about the Bayshore? He did. That's a lot of ground to cover in the time that we have tonight, but I will give it my best shot and will share some of what I know the best I can. You should probably know about, as I have called him, the greatest Middletown writer you probably never heard of. After tonight, you will have heard of him, and may, as I have, want to learn more. If you have never before heard of Henry Morford, you are not alone. He is so unknown that he does not even have a Wikipedia page. Yet. As a writer, he has been neglected for almost a century and a half. There are a few reasons for that neglect. One of them is that despite having substantial poetic talent and performing ability, he tended to write some rather long poems and thought that they would be entertaining to perform before audiences. This worked in the ancient Greek poet Homer's day, but not in P.T. Barnum's day. A second reason, Morford was a best-selling novel during the Civil War by writing about the Civil War. But after the war ended, those novels faded from popularity quickly when people no longer wanted to think about the war. Here's a third reason. Morford was networked with several late 19th century literary humorists, people like Artemus Ward, aka Charles Farrar Brown, Benjamin P. Shillaber, aka Mrs. Partington, Josh Billings, aka Henry Wheeler Shaw, all of whom have faded from public memory, but were lesser known figures of the same movement in American literature that produced Mark Twain, aka Samuel Langhorne Clemens. A problem with literary humor is that it's timely. It often depends on current common sense and current events. When the current events fade from memory to history, the humor makes less sense, falls flat, is not humorous at all. And some people have a negative view of Henry Morford because of his literary output for what seem to be two reasons. The first is that as a writer, he was remarkably diverse in genre and prolific in output. He wrote for at least a half dozen periodicals, two of them a newspaper and a magazine he owned. He published a sequel to a long poem by Lord Byron and a sequel to a novel by Charles Dickens, showing himself adept at imitating other authors. He also wrote at least 7 novels, at least 6 plays, 3 collections of short poetry, several longer poems, some of which he performed publicly. I feel like I should say, and a partridge in a pear tree at the end of that. At least 2 of the novels were considered bestsellers in their day during the Civil War. The argument against Morford here is that by writing in so many different categories of writing, journalism, nonfiction, short poems, long poems, plays, and novels, he was spreading himself too thin, published in multiple genres, but master of none of them. A second reason is that after the Civil War, he increasingly turned away from these literary forms and towards writing travel guides. Besides publishing several articles about travel in several periodicals, he wrote 7 books of travel guides, directing Americans through New York City and Brooklyn, across the country to California, across the border to Canada, and across the Atlantic to Scotland, England, Paris, and other places in Western Europe. When he died in 1881, he was perhaps best known for that travel writing. Here again, the issue is that travel guides are useful at the time they are published, but quickly become outdated and even useless. And, at least at present, in academic settings, travel guides are often not considered to be literature. Perhaps representative of the negative view of Morford is the assessment of Daniel Webster Hollis III, who says that his skills in composing descriptive travelogues surpassed other literary efforts at poetry and fiction. According to Hollis, Morford's Civil War novels revealed unsophisticated character development and were filled with contrived details and rhetorical flourishes. And his few post-war novels reflect mediocre talent at best. Acknowledging that at least Morford was prolific, Hollis concludes, Henry Morford's travel descriptions were the only books that both commanded extensive attention and reflected a degree of literary ability. His verses were not widely known or respected by contemporary critics, and he did not remain long enough with any newspaper or periodical to establish a journalistic reputation. Thus, his experience as a journalist seemed best suited to descriptive rather than aesthetic or provocative literature. One may gently object to Hollis's assumption that being a journalist and writing aesthetic or provocative literature were incompatible. Perhaps that incompatibility is the case now, but in the 19th century, this was not yet the case. Many writers, especially literary humorists, were also newspaper editors, with the benefits of generating newspaper content, as well as publicity for the lecture circuit and content for book-length collections. So, Henry Morford is a writer who wrote journalism, war novels, and travel guides for his time. He was popular in his own time. For some writers, the goal may be to endure short-term neglect to achieve lasting greatness. And for other writers, the goal may be short-term popularity, which in the long term may be damning. One could just focus on what we now think of as lastingly great writers, but that provides only a partial view of what actually occurred back at the time, biased in the direction of what we value now rather than broadening our understanding of what we can value. In other words, that much of Morford's writing was only momentarily popular does not mean that it was unpopular, just that its popularity was short-lived. Nor does momentary popularity mean that his works were not good, just that different definitions of good may apply. The labels lastingly great and important at the time are not the same thing, but are differently good. Many of Morford's contemporaries praised and then eulogized him as newspaperman, novelist, poet, and travel author. Monmouth County historian Franklin Ellis, 4 years after Morford's death, describes him as having attained distinction as an author before listing some of his books. By the mid-20th century, 2 Columbia University graduate students were working on Henry Morford's works and life. In 1948, Stephen J. Hazelton wrote an MA thesis focusing on Morford's Civil War novels. And in 1954, the journal American Literature noted a doctoral dissertation in progress entitled A Critical Biography of Henry Morford by Shirley J. Quentzell Horner. While Horner appears not to have completed or published that dissertation, over the next 3 decades, she nevertheless persisted in her interest in Henry Morford. In September 1973, she published an article on him in the Monmouth County Historical Association newsletter. There, Horner's focus is not Morford's travel writing or journalism, so much as his much more clearly literary output, his poetry, fiction, and plays. Her article begins, quote, "When his day of full literary recognition arrives, Monmouth County native residents will have special reason to be proud of Henry Morford." Much of Horner's article provides a primary bibliography and brief description of his literary works, dividing his development as a writer into 3 stages, suggesting possible book chapters. In 1982, Horner's article was reprinted by the Morford historian herself, Enid Adams, in Adams's 1982 Morford Family Newsletter. After the 1973 article and its 1982 reprint, both editors call attention to the fact that Horner was writing a book about Morford, evidently the proposed dissertation from decades earlier. I've checked with Ken Cutler, a Henry Morford descendant and somebody who knows even more about Henry's life than I do. Mr. Cutler knew Shirley Horner and actually met her, but says that she had not pursued her proposed biography project. I wrote to Shirley Horner's son and asked him about his mother's research, but never received a response. Stephen Hazelton did finish his thesis in 1948, went on to get his doctorate, and served for many years as a professor and administrator at Kean University, but he never published his master's thesis on Morford. He died several years ago. The trail is growing cold. To date, biographically about Henry Morford, there has been only Shirley Horner's 2 pages in a 1973 newsletter. Tonight, with the help of the Middletown Township Historical Society, perhaps we can start to change that. Chanceville Beginnings, 1823 to 1839. Henry Morford was born 200 years ago this month on March 10th, 1823, in what is now New Monmouth, Middletown Township, New Jersey. He grew up and went to school there, got his first job, and was even the village's first postmaster. He lived there until he moved to Keyport, where he lived for a few years before moving on to New York City in 1856. So he lived in Monmouth County his first 30 plus years, over half of his life. After his death on August 4th, 1881, though a resident of New York, he was brought back home to Middletown and is buried in the old First Baptist burial ground in Middletown Village, just a couple of miles from where he was born and raised. He was a Middletowner through and through. One way to understand him is to understand the circumstances into which he came into the world, the land, the society, and the family into which he was born. In 1823, when he was born there, New Monmouth was called Chanceville. According to the township website, the name for the village from when it was founded around 1815 up until the 1850s. According to the memoir of the charming Thomas Leonard, Chanceville, now New Monmouth, was named for a Mr. Chance, a former resident. The name change occurred in the late 1850s or early 1860s, perhaps after people had started to forget about Mr. Chance, or perhaps there was greater commercial value and public association of the village with the development of the nearby port or the county. To this day, Chanceville as a local place name is still preserved in New Monmouth by a street name, Chanceville Place, and by a township recreation area, Chanceville Park. If Henry Morford's memoir essays, written decades later, are any indication, in the 1820s, Chanceville was perhaps a few steps removed from being a frontier village. The chief activities appear to have been agriculture and lumber. As for farming, according to Morford's accounts, there tended to be small family plots that were cultivated, some of them including livestock like pigs, cattle, and chickens. The cultivated land likely would have thrived because of the Bayshore's somewhat warmer and moister environment, as well as the creeks that rise in higher terrain to the south and flow northward towards the Bayshore. Pugh's Creek, Mill Brook, Compton's Creek, Town Brook. The area was originally wooded, but gradually as the land was cleared, agriculture expanded. So along with farming and related to it, another chief activity was lumber and firewood. Morford writes about one man, Tom Burt, who used a wagon to haul logs to a mill, and another, old Joe Bramby, who trespassed on other people's properties to collect firewood. As for the mill, there appears to have been a sawmill on what is now the southeast corner of where Mill Brook crosses Cherry Tree Farm Road. The local lumber business flourished for decades. Even into the early 1850s, Morford's father and brother ran a lumber yard immediately to the west of what is now the Baptist Church at the main crossroads. In turn, the lumber business made possible local construction of homes and barns. No doubt, the very oldest local structures still standing today were built with local lumber. The lumber business also made possible the construction of plank roads, the paving technology that preceded macadamizing and that made it possible to construct roadways through swampy areas, common along the Bayshore, such as from New Monmouth north to Port Monmouth, another venture in which some members of the Morford family were involved. So the Chanceville in which Henry Morford was born in 1823 and raised in the 1830s and 40s was very much a dynamic village in transition, with many wooded areas receding back from the roadways as farms and buildings which the land clearing made possible sprang up. The earliest non-literary depiction I have so far found dates from June 3rd, 1844, and was published in 1845. Few people seem to have heard of it, and that may be because it could be called an inadvertent map. By that, I mean the map is intended to be not a map of New Jersey or Monmouth County, but rather is a nautical map of greater New York Harbor. I don't know if you can see, but there's barely any land to the left side of the screen there. The 1845 Hassler map depicts settlements adjacent to the bay, perhaps only as navigational aids or to show where it was safe to land or where one might seek help. At the time of the map, Chanceville was the settlement nearest the bay. The map depicts it, but not villages further inland like Middletown Village. Hassler's 1845 map of New York Bay depicts what Chanceville of the 1840s looked like, and perhaps with our imagination, it can suggest something of what Chanceville of the 1820s was like. Clustered around the crossroads at the center of Chanceville are about 20 buildings. Beyond that, Some cultivated areas are along the south of what is now Cherry Tree Farm Road and on both sides of New Monmouth Road, but mainly along the sides of those roads. However, further away from those roads, south and west and north and elsewhere, large areas around Chanceville are shown as wooded. And that is in 1845. The areas around Chanceville must have been even more wooded 2 decades earlier when Henry was born there in 1823. Now, that is a geographical approach to where Henry was born, the place. There is also the society and the family into which he was born. One of Morford's sketches, Sam Brown's Mush, says that when Henry was growing up in Chanceville, most residents were middle to lower class and not all that different from each other. The sketch was published in 1863, but set some 25 years ago in 1838. When, Morford says, primitive food and fashions were much more in vogue than they are at present, and the section was very near the place of my own residence at that time, where homely comforts were plenty enough, but luxuries almost entirely unknown. The description does slightly separate Morford's father's home, the place of my own residence at that time, from the section or Chanceville. However, the passage refers to how at that time, both locations valued quote unquote primitive food and fashions. The referent of where luxuries were almost entirely unknown is grammatically ambiguous. It can refer to the subject of the clause, the section of Chanceville, or to the nearest noun, the adjacent house where Morford grew up. It's unclear whether the place of almost entirely unknown luxuries in Chanceville is Chanceville or Henry Morford's childhood home. However, it is true that Henry Morford was born into one of the more prominent families in Monmouth County. A substantial body of genealogical research about the Morford family shows its establishment in Monmouth County in the 17th century and its generational spread across the United States, first to Delaware and Pennsylvania, then west to Indiana and Kentucky, and eventually to Iowa, where there is a Morfordsville, and beyond. However, the narrowness of my theme confines me to the branch of the family that stayed in New Jersey, and specifically to Monmouth County, and about 5 or 6 generations up the family tree. Even then, as Mary Ann Kiernan helpfully diagrams, the Monmouth County Morford family diverged around the time of Henry's great-grandfather Thomas into 2 branches established in Red Bank and further west in Chanceville. Certainly, the Morfords were among the most prominent families in Chanceville. Speaking of Middletown Township, the 1922 History of Monmouth County says that the land in the western part of the township north of Middletown Village, on which New Monmouth, formerly Chanceville, is situated, was formerly owned by the Morford family, which implies that far enough back, Henry Morford's paternal grandfather, William Sr., owned much or even all of Chanceville. Mary Ann Kiernan suggests that the exact dates of the Morford family acquisition of the Chanceville lands are difficult to determine because most records indicate not Chanceville, but Middletown. But the acquisition was gradual and over decades. William Sr. was acquiring land locally in several plots between 1797 and 1816. And after his death in 1828, his lands were acquired and divided among his 4 surviving sons by 1832. Some of his sons then added to their land holdings, as Henry's father, William Jr. did, by acquiring more land in 4 stages between 1823 and 1856. Randy Gabrielan refers to several Morford farms, including one near Swartzel Road. This is confirmed by an 1851 county map, the Lightfoot map, which shows a remarkable arc of Morford farms extending from the west of Chanceville to the south of the center of Chanceville, an area of many acres. Here's a detail. (1851). In present terms, this is the whole area extending south from what is now Cherry Tree Farm Road, between what is now east of Harmony Road and east of Tyndall Road. From west to east, the map labels the 4 Morford farms: E. Morford, W. Morford, T. Morford, and C. Morford. There's actually 2 C. Morfords. Relative to Henry Morford, this would have been his paternal grandfather, William Morford, and his paternal grandmother, Lydia Stout Morford's 4 sons: Henry's uncle Elias, Henry's uncle William, and Henry's uncles Thomas and Charles. Elias and William had farms on the south side of Cherry Tree Farm Road. Thomas's was on what is now New Monmouth Road, and Charles's was near Tyndall and Swartzel Roads. Growing up in Chanceville, Henry would have had access to all of it. Some vestiges of the Morford presence in Chanceville still remain or can be identified. I cannot address every such place, but perhaps I can mention a few. What is maybe the most obvious vestige is Morford Road. First shown 10 years later on the 1861 Beers map as an unpaved driveway to what would have been Henry's uncle Elias's house. Beyond the end of the current road, I'm told by a local resident, Brian Beekman, that that's Elias's home, which still stands on 19 Heather Lane, built in the 1740s. Just to the west of that, on Cherry Tree Farm Road, the road bends slightly northward to avoid at least one older home. Mr. Beekman tells me that at this bend are the Lone Oak Farmhouse, 46 Cherry Tree Farm Road, owned by the Morfords, and the other, the Walling House, 51 Cherry Tree Farm Road. The 1851 Lightfoot and the later 1861 Beers map confirms a house at this location owned by W. Morford, probably by that time Henry's father, William, who appears to have lived there prior to his first marriage. There is another W. Morford residence, a large house at the northwest corner of Cherry Tree Farm Road and Leonardville Road. Randy Gabriel identified it as 1 Cherry Tree Farm Road, long a Morford residence, and once the seat of a large farm, and shows it dating back to 1765. It is associated with a local insurance company. Mary Ann Kiernan says Henry's paternal grandfather, William Sr., was born in 1764 and died in 1828, which means he was likely to have lived there. That's his paternal grandfather. Kiernan also says that Henry's father, William Jr., was born in 1796 and died in 1768. I, for one, am curious about where in Chanceville Henry Morford might have been born. To know this, one must know when William Jr. moved from the farmhouse west on Cherry Tree Farm Road to the larger house of his father at the village crossroads. Franklin Ellis, writing in 1885, may provide the answer. William Morford, he says, soon after his marriage, removed to the house now occupied by his son, George, at New Monmouth. William Jr. was married twice, and I take Ellis's use of the word marriage to refer to the first marriage. George Morford was Henry's half-brother, born of William Jr.'s second wife, Joanna Johnson. This would mean that William Jr. and his first wife, Elizabeth, moved into William Sr.'s home at the crossroads about 5 years before William Sr.'s death, perhaps to take care of his parents. This means that what's now 1 Cherry Tree Farm Road is Henry Morford's likely birthplace. But one cannot absolutely discount the possibility of the William Morford farmhouse to the west. Another site associated with the Morfords, and Henry in particular, is their family store, where Henry was employed and which provided him with access to stories from his father and uncle and exposure to a wide variety of village life that he reflected in his writings. Thomas Leonard says that the Morfords ran one of 2 stores in Chanceville, the other being operated by the Hallenbake family. Much uncertainty has been caused by Franklin Ellis's phrasing his description of the possible location of the Morford store. William Morford, soon after his marriage, removed to the house now occupied by his son George at New Monmouth, where he engaged in mercantile pursuits, continuing thus employed for a period of more than 40 years. Grammatically, this is a challenging construction. The ambiguity is over where is. The house or the village. Some, such as Gabriel Ann and Kiernan, see where as possibly referring to the house. And certainly it is true that many families combine their homes and places of business. However, as Kiernan observes, the 1851 Lightfoot map distinguishes among the two houses owned by William Morford and the two stores mentioned by Leonard. At different times, the Morford brothers owned at least two businesses in Chanceville, a store and a lumber yard. I favor the where of the store's location, referring not to the house at the crossroads, but where referring rather to New Monmouth. For me, the tiebreaker is Henry Morford being Chanceville's first postmaster. I zoomed in a little bit here. Multiple historical accounts and even official records show him in that role from 1840 to 1850. On the Lightfoot map, two stores are mentioned. There's one, here's the other. But only one is indicated as store and PO. This would mean that Chanceville's first post office and the Morford brothers store were both located a short distance from the family home on the east side of Leonardville Road, just north of its fork with Church Street, near where the parking lots for St. Mary's Chapel are today. As for Henry's childhood, which was spent among all these places, all sources agree that he was educated locally. While one cannot be certain of where the local Chanceville schoolhouse was located in the 1830s when Henry would have been attending it, the 1851 Lightfoot map indicates a schoolhouse labeled SH on the south side of what's now Cherry Tree Farm Road between Millbrook and the village crossroads, a short distance west of the crossroads. Now, it seems unlikely that records will surface revealing what young Henry would have been learning at school sometime in the 1830s. However, given historical trends in American publication at that time, public education at that time, and how the adult Henry turned out, a few inferences may be drawn about his childhood education. One is that Henry, as an adult, enjoyed reading aloud and performing in public, and may even be said to have earned his living from his public speaking skills. Some measure of this may be gleaned from the back or verso of his September 16th, 1861 letter to Freehold newspaper editor James S. Yard of the Monmouth Democrat, courtesy of the Monmouth County Historical Association. Morford wrote on the back of a flyer advertising his lectures and public readings. These long poems and lectures include Fun, which he once performed in Freehold, and Almost, sufficiently popular to be included in his 1873 collection, Rhymes of an Editor. Almost may be too much. It is in heroic couplets in 41 sections and goes on for 37 single-spaced pages. Tammany and Union is another notable example. On July 4th, 1862, the Tammany Society celebrated Independence Day with a banquet event that featured Morford performing a poem he had specially composed for the occasion, Tammany and Union. The official published account of the correspondence says, quote, Mr. Morford then proceeded to read in a clear and distinct voice the following poem, which throughout elicited tumultuous and prolonged applause. The poem is in political verse, 15 syllable, or if you're an English major, decapentasyllabic lines, and then goes on for 9 pages, single spaced. 2 days later, the New York Times reported, perhaps more objectively, that Morford's poem, quote, received frequent applause. It was full of points and timely hits. And if it had only been half as long, it would have been doubly acceptable. How did Morford even land the gig? Besides lecturing and performing, Morford read publicly as part of his job, as he says in the Yard letter, a public official reader for the city councils of New York. So it seems likely that as a child, Henry was exposed to public speaking in school, whether that was recitation, reading aloud, or more likely oratory. Oratory was a standard part of early American education. One famous school textbook example is Caleb Bingham's 1798 textbook, The Columbian Orator, which inspired other writers like Frederick Douglass because of its patriotic and anti-slavery content. It was in its 18th edition by 1816 and was still in print and widely used by the time Henry attended public school in Chanceville in the 1830s. By that time, there were other oratory manuals, and Henry's school could have used any of those as well. But the popularity and influence of Bingham's textbook makes it more likely that young Henry studied public speaking. Henry's 1830s Chanceville public education was interrupted by a family tragedy. Shortly after the 1834-1835 winter holidays, Henry would have been 12 years old. According to Franklin Ellis, Henry's older brother James was about 16, and their younger sisters Elizabeth and Margaret were about 5 and 3, respectively. Sadly, in January 1835, their birth mother, Elizabeth Willett Morford, passed away. This loss must have been devastating for the whole family, and perhaps especially for Henry, who at 12 years old might have had to assume greater family responsibilities for a time. A little over a year and a half later, in October 1836, when Henry was 14, his father, William, married Henry's new stepmother, Joanna Johnson Morford. This transition to a new maternal authority figure in the family home must also have had its challenges for a teenage boy. Bushy Hollow and the Standard, 1838, 1856. Perhaps as a result of these changes, Henry seems to have turned inwardly and started writing poetry. Morford's extant manuscripts show that by age 16, around 1839, he was writing poetry imitating popular romantic poets he is likely to have encountered through school, such as Thomas More of Ireland and Robert Burns of Scotland, as well as Lord Byron, to each of whom he dedicated early poems in his sketchbooks. In his sketchbooks, 3 of which have been identified and preserved. Harvard University has a sketchbook of his dated between 1839 and 1842, containing 5 or 6 poems. The Harry Ransom Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin also has a Morford scrapbook containing some fragments from letters from this time. However, the Monmouth County Historical Association has another sketchbook of his dated to around 1840, the largest and most complete of the 3, containing 24 poems. In both the Harvard and Monmouth sketchbooks, the poems appear not to be working manuscript drafts, but finalized fair copies. The poems are often preceded or followed by a hand-drawn ornament to serve as an eye break between poems or to fill up unused space at the bottoms of pages. In many cases, the poems' titles are written in distinctive handwriting. One of the Historical Association sketchbook poems, My Childhood's Home, which you see pictured here, wistfully recalls earlier and happier days. Here's a stanza from it. And oft I have dreamed of the days of my youth, and childhood's come back with the freshness of truth. When I woke, I have sighed that it was but a dream, but a fast fading vision, so bright did it seem. The poem goes on to bemoan that the earlier times are gone. Now, while it may seem odd to read a poem about the days of my youth written by a teenager, It is also true that Henry Morford had recently been through the loss of his birth mother and adapting to a new stepmother. At about this time, the year 1840, when Henry was about 17, it was a pivotal year in his life for at least 4 reasons. First, his half-sister Margaret was born. In the Morford household, the new arrival would have garnered much attention. A baby sister might also have shifted some attention away from Henry and his siblings of William Jr.'s first wife. Second, as the Monmouth and Harvard poetry sketchbooks from 1839 to 1842 suggest, Henry Morford was beginning to submit poems to the Philadelphia and New York periodicals, with multiple poems appearing in print starting in 1840. The Harvard scrapbook in particular may have been a portfolio of fair copies of his poems to send out for publication. Several of the poems are numbered, suggesting some scheme of organization, but with numbers being skipped as if contents were missing. In his preface to his 1859 collection, Rhymes of 20 Years, he says, quote, 20 years have elapsed since the publication by the writer of his first poems in the New Yorker, the Philadelphia Evening Post, and other newspapers of that day, which would have been 1839, 1840. The New Yorker poems appear to be Avenger, The Dying Year, and Merry Dancers, all published in 1840. Also in the same year, Morford published his first book, a 7-page poem entitled Music of the Spheres, dedicated to Nathaniel P. Willis. By this time, Willis had already published books of poem and travel literature and had purchased and edited his own magazine, American Monthly Magazine, in which he published his own works, including his 1829 essay, Unwritten Music, that Morford's poems dedication praises and his title echoes. Willis's essay was often anthologized, and Morford may have encountered it reprinted in a school book, such as an elocution manual or a reader. Morford took away from Willis's essay its emphasis on auditory observation, on listening carefully to the sounds of the world around oneself. Willis's essay begins by contrasting intentional human music with the unwritten music of which the world is full. Quote, there is no sound of simple nature that is not music. Willis's essay's influence on Morford is specifically evident about a page into Willis's essay, where Morford's book title, Music of the Spheres, seems drawn from Willis's remark that, quote, the sounds we daily listen to are but part of a melody that reaches to the very center of God's illimitable spheres. Much of Willis's essay focuses on the beauty of the sounds of nature, of the human voice, and of bells, all readily accessible. In turn, Morford's poem repeatedly quotes Willis's phrase, unwritten music, as it repeats Willis's overall point, but applies it to other examples based on his own local observations. Thunder, streams, ocean waves, wind, birds, and bees, all things he observed in or near Chanceville. 1840 was important to Henry Morford for a fourth reason, which is that by then he appears to have completed his formal education and started working with his father and his uncle Charles at his family's newly opened general store. This was the beginning of Henry's informal higher education. His work in the family store as a storekeeper and postmaster brought him into regular contact with a wide variety of local residents. And at work, he had the benefit of interacting with his father and uncle, who appear to have given him advice and told him further stories. One source of information about Henry Morford at this time are some letters he sent to a friend, Therese Walling, mainly in the 1840s, in the Vera Conover collection, preserved by the Monmouth County Historical Association. All of the stories Henry was hearing and observing for himself at the post office and general store started accumulating and having an effect. In the early 1840s, he was continuing to write and publish individual poems. He also studied Lord Byron's poem, Don Juan, and began composing a sequel to it, The Rest of John Juan, another long poem of 44 pages, eventually published in 1846. However, in a November 5th, 1845 letter to Therese Walling, Morford confides that besides the poetry, he has another writing project in mind. By the way, if you are not too indignant to entertain the correspondence, I shall one of these days or nights sit down to prove to you in earnest that egotism, even so called, is not only one of the most common qualities of the mind, but also one of the most necessary, and still more, one of the most delightful, for which labor I have in my storehouse, not all, a collection of trifles not unworthy of an antiquarian, which I mean to publish from the press of Gammon and Company Utopia, a land near the Happy Valley, sometime during this millennium, and in the name of egotism versus modesty. Here in this lengthy sentence may be the seed of Morford's newspaper sketches of the 1850s and early 1860s, and eventually his selection and revision of some of them published in book form in 1863. Sprees and Splashes. In the 1845 letter to Walling, 22-year-old Henry Morford imagines a published collection of stories based on his memories. His metaphor for his own head, a storehouse, is reminiscent of St. Augustine's memory palace in his Confessions, as well as the Morford Brothers store in Chanceville, at which Henry had been working. He intends to write trifles, not a sustained effort like a novel, but shorter and lighter pieces. He intends not to write egotistically to indulge himself, but rather to write out of necessity about his own experiences and observations because he knows them best. Henry Morford's writing of poetry starting in the late 1830s and his 1845 idea for a collection of trifles not unworthy of an antiquarian culminated in his purchasing and editorship of the New Jersey Standard, a newspaper he owned and operated between 1852 and 1856. The Library of Congress says that the newspaper had originally been founded in 1845 as the Democratic Banner and Monmouth County Advertiser by George C. Waite, who sold it to George W. Bell and Charles W. Fountain in 1851. The paper was edited by Bell and published weekly out of Middletown Point, now Matawan. Morford seems to have purchased the paper in late 1851 or early 1852. The first issue under Morford's new name, The Standard, was a specimen issue, a trial issue, on January 15th, 1852. However, the Democratic Banner continued publication through March 25th, 1852. Morford's paper began its weekly run starting the following week with Volume 1, Number 1, on April 1st, 1852. From the very first issue, he regularly published his poetry, fiction, and nonfiction in it, often on the front page. As an 1898 account has it, the paper was started in 1852 by Henry Morford, who was more of a literary writer than a newspaper man, though in those days a newspaper was more of a literary affair than it is at present, 1898. In its first years, the Standard consisted almost wholly of literary articles, essays, and poetry, and very little attention was given to gathering the local news. Newspapers then printed as news the speeches of the members of Congress from the district and paid much more attention to politics and legislation at the national capital than to home affairs. From half a column to a column of local news was all that country papers contained in those days, and sometimes the amount of local news was less than a quarter of a column. A 1911 account claims more directly that Morford's main motivation for being a newspaper owner was not to disseminate news or even to make money, but to self-publish. He was a poet as well as a short story writer, and he had hard work to get all of his poems and stories printed in those days of few magazines. He started the Standard in order that it could print whatever he wrote without any editor having anything to say about it. He published the paper for several years in this way. The paper did not make any money under his ownership, for it was not intended to make money. After he had been editor of the paper 5 or 6 years, he engaged Charles Conroe as editor, but he retained the right to print all the poems and stories in the Standard that he wanted to. Charles Conroe moved the paper to Red Bank, where for several years it was the Red Bank Standard. As I've suggested elsewhere, in his newspaper starting in 1835, Morford published nonfiction memoir sketches of his time growing up in Chanceville, which he fictionalizes as a village called Bushy Hollow, perhaps a play on the name of Washington Irving's better known Sleepy Hollow. 4 of the newspaper sketches, later reprinted in Sprees and Splashes, explicitly mention both the place Bushy Hollow and the time of 20 to 25 years earlier, which would be 1838 to 1843. At least 2 other possible Bushy Hollow sketches were published in the Standard, but excluded from this volume. Can't Dine Off My Lobster and A Fishing Holiday. Can't Dine Off My Lobster, as a newspaper sketch, mentions a town, Shortport, that is also the setting of the 14th sketch in Sprees, the Great Shortport Burglary, which suggests that both sketches share a common fictional geography. A Fishing Holiday sketch seems likely to have been set also, at least partly, in Bushy Hollow. The sketch does not mention Bushy Hollow by name and does not specify how many years earlier than the present the sketch is set. However, the sketch recounts an event that occurred once upon a time back when the narrator worked in a store. So from near the beginning of the story. I was in the counter jumping business about those days, as idle a hound as ever sold moldy cheese and measured off damaged calico, pert to my superiors, saucy to my equals, patronizing to my inferiors, if I had any. I had the whole science of shirking labor by heart, could play more games of checkers in a given length of time and play them worse than anyone else in town, sleep on the counter of a warm day without compunction, and used up more of the profits in Welsh rabbits, candy, and cigars than what was at all conducive to the general welfare of the establishment. Starting in 1840, Henry Morford worked in his father and uncle's Chanceville store. So what the sketches narrator described may have occurred to Morford within the 1840 to 1843 portion of the Bushy Hollow period, or shortly thereafter. Now, I have to apologize because I was going to share with you one of his stories, but I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Much bibliographical work on these sketches remain. Here, 2 observations. First, in order to expand some of these newspaper sketches from their original use as column-inch filler and to make them more acceptable to a general audience, Morford revised some of the newspaper sketches before publishing them in the Sprees book. The result is sometimes 2 versions of the same sketch. An example of this is the first Bushy Hollow sketch, Old Joe Bramby. In the newspaper sketch, good old Joe drinks moonshine. And there is a hint that his speech impediment may be due to excessive consumption of it. However, in the book sketch, rated G, Old Joe appears to be a teetotaler. With the same sketch, Morford also expanded the newspaper version by tacking on to the end an anecdote about Old Joe visiting the city. Morford revised other sketches between newspaper and book publication so that some of the Sprees sketches exist in 2 versions. Second, Morford's body of humorous sketches extends far beyond Sprees. He was associated with several newspapers in which he published sketches, including his own New Jersey Standard, starting in 1852, followed by several successive newspapers in New York City. Earl Marble says the Sunday Courier, Dispatch, Atlas, and Frank Leslie's, and others, at least up to 1875. To give an example of just one of these newspapers, several of the Spree sketches first appeared in the New York Atlas newspaper as a regular feature, droll recollections of town and country, later Spree's subtitle, between 1860 and 1862, during which time Morford published in the Atlas at least 32 sketches. Spree's itself, the book, contains only 27, several of which appeared prior to Morford's employment at the Atlas. The newspaper sketches were so numerous and popular that there were plans for a sequel to Spree's. A dozen years after Spree's publication in 1875, Earl Marble reported that among Mr. Morford's miscellaneous books was a droll one in 1863 called Sprees and Splashes, containing many queer recollections of New York and the country, which was to be, and perhaps will be, followed by another, bearing the alliterative title of Fits and Frolics, with the same general features. Sadly, the sequel to Spree's never happened. But in some of these newspapers just mentioned, Morford's sketches have been preserved. As I said, from a bibliographical perspective, there remains much to do. Going to skip ahead a little bit more. A little bit on this. Miracle year, 1863, 1864. In the 19 months between January 1863 and July 1864, Henry Morford published 4 books in 19 months. The first of these I just mentioned, Sprees and Splashes. And for a Middletown audience, that book might be a good place to start reading Morford. Sprees and Splashes is the work of a minor American humorist. At the time, American literary humor was emerging into the mainstream. However, placed into the historical context of the Civil War, Sprees and Splashes can be understood as sentimental humor intended to cheer up the home front. In fact, this was how the book's publisher, Carleton, marketed the books in its advertisements. Among Morford's best-known and best-selling works were 3 novels he wrote during and about the American Civil War: Shoulder Straps, The Days of Shoddy, and The Coward, published in only 13 months, July 1863 to July 1864. These were among Morford's most popular works at the time, and in recent years are the only aspect of his literary output to receive scholarly attention. That attention has focused less on the novel's artistic merits and more on their usefulness as historical artifacts of popular taste and Northern politics during the American Civil War. Historian Michael Thomas Smith notes the Days of Shoddy was popular, and his next novel, The Coward, was almost an equally massive follow-up. Some measure of the popularity of Days of Shoddy is that it has been credited with popularizing a shift in the meaning of the word shoddy to refer to intentionally inferior materials and workmanship. The word's meaning today is still as Morford's narrator defined it 150 years ago. The novels sold well then and are examined now, not because they are blindly patriotic, but because they are critically patriotic. Shoulder Straps is about the concept of what we now call stolen valor, people representing themselves as veterans or war heroes when they're not. The Days of Shoddy examines war profiteering, the fulfillment of government contracts for military supplies by providing goods of inferior quality, and its adverse effects on both the war effort and society. and the title of The Coward seems self-explanatory. All three novels do not romanticize the war, but rather call attention to debates on the home front and their effects on the war effort. Morford's three novels were inspired by and written about the Civil War. After such a crisis ends and its literature has served its purpose, the literature becomes less popular, perhaps not even nostalgic, but gradually forgotten, if only because psychologically people may achieve closure on the crisis by trying to move forward and beyond it. Briefly popular during the war, Morford's popular Civil War novels were forgotten soon after, even by 20th century scholars who focused on the literature of the Civil War. Historian J. Matthew Gallman says, quote, "When I first stumbled upon Henry Morford, his novels were completely absent from scholarly discussions. Literary historians of the Civil War period, Edmund Wilson, Daniel Aaron, and Alice Faz made no mention of his fiction. Especially in the interdisciplinary field of American studies, contemporary scholars are now beginning to re-examine these novels in their historical context as being inspired by and attempting to intervene in the war by shaping opinions on the home front. In Smith's The Enemy Within, much of its first chapter is devoted to examining the relationship between statements by the novel's narrator and characters in the days of shoddy and home front politics and attitudes towards the war. See pages 15 through 36, especially 22 through 29. For those readers interested in a different perspective on the Civil War, the three novels might be a good starting point. Ironically, of the 4 books Henry Morford published in the space of about a year and a half, including at least 2 of them that were bestsellers, it's the least well-known, Sprees and Splashes, that indicates the future direction his writing career took. Sprees is an early effort at writing that pertained to travel, but was entertaining. Morford had produced descriptive travel writing as early as 1853 as editorial filler in his newspaper. Over the next decade, he began writing the sketches that he published in newspapers and then collected in Sprees and Splashes. That book does not give descriptions of travel or landscapes, but rather light entertainment for travelers, those wanting to pass time while traveling or waiting for a train, or with, as he calls it, odd half hours to spare. After Sprees, Morford's later travel writing, starting with his book Oversea, 1867, conveys travel information while also being entertaining as well. In this sense, Sprees and Splashes is a central work in Morford's career. It collects some of his earlier writings from newspapers. Like his contemporaneous war novels, it is a response to the Civil War, but unlike the novels, it tries to lift readers' spirits. And because Sprees is explicitly intended as entertainment for travelers, it foreshadows his focus on travel guides after the Civil War. To this, one may add that as a book of nonfiction, Sprees adds yet another genre to the wide range of types of writing that Morford produced. Best of all for this audience, in its 4 sketches about life in Bushy Hollow, it preserves, in what amounts to a literary time capsule, Morford's memories of having come of age in Chanceville so long ago. Though I have necessarily slighted Henry Morford's final years, and I've overlooked many details of his life, such as the illness that drove him overseas and into a new aspect of his career, his marriage and his affair, and his misfortunes with money. I've also slighted his works, such as the plays he wrote, which sound interesting, and 2 later novels, apparently set in Monmouth County. I think I have actually managed to touch on the 5 or 6 points I initially set out to address. And if not, you can kindly remind me during the question and answer session that follows. Thank you for listening, and especially thank you for thinking for a little while about Henry Morford, who I think would be overwhelmed by your presence gathered here tonight in his hometown on the occasion of his 200th birthday. Happy birthday, Henry.
You can leave it on, that's fine.
I'll tell you what, I'll put up a little bonus.
All right, thank you for that. That was great. If anybody has any questions in the audience, you can let us know. And also, if you have any questions online, you can put it into the chat feature.
My wife, I've been married to 56 years, lived on 12 Morford Road. Her dad built a house there in the late 60s or mid 60s. And I remember there was a farm. It was right at the end of Morford Road. Morford Road was a short road if she lived in the moment. But there still was a farm, a working farm.
Wow. I'm told there are two older houses there.
There is.
And one of them is probably Uncle Elias's house. Morford Road was his driveway. In fact, let me see here. I think
Because there's a split in the road at the end of Morford Road. Right now, there's a new community there, like 3 large homes. But
Tom, can you get me back into my my PowerPoint here? I must have pressed the wrong button. It's okay. I think I'll just I'll scroll through until I get to it. I'm sorry, it was a map I skipped, but I want to show you if I can.
The yellow. Was that the
There it is. So this is the 1861 Beers map. And if you look closely, right here, that's what became Morford Road. And the E Morford is for Elias, who's Henry's uncle. So that's the first time it appears, and the dashed lines suggest unpaved dirt road. Yes.
That was excellent. Really was outstanding. And
Thank you.
known the Morford family, I was proud of them. It just probably 2 questions. One, all these writings, are any of them reproduced or accessible? You mentioned that some of them are MTHS.
They are all accessible online. There are digital facsimiles of them, scans. The source that I use is the Internet Archive or archive.org. It's free. You may also find some of his books on Google Books. And there's a third eText repository that I could give you if you want, but those first 2 have a lot of it. I, in some ways, prefer, although I own some physical copies of the actual books, I prefer, especially in classroom settings, to work with the digital versions.
Second question.
Sure.
As much as you look like some.
That's great. I would consider that to be a compliment.
And how did this whole topic come to you?
Well, it was indirectly. One of the things I do at my university is teach courses on New Jersey literature. So I teach an undergraduate course that's a statewide literature survey. I know there are some objections, but it's divided into 3 units, North, Central, and South. The students from North and South don't believe there's a Central, but I'm trying to persuade them, So that's a survey course for undergraduates. And on the graduate level, I teach a course entitled New Jersey Literary Heritage. That focuses in even more narrowly geographically. I did one version of the course and maybe this will be of interest to this audience, one version of the course that focused on literature pertaining to Sandy Hook and Highlands. And that was enough to sustain an entire course, and there was a lot there. But to your point, the next version, the next time I taught the course, it was about the literature of Long Branch. Now, believe it or not, I found so much that I could not possibly include all of it. Henry Morford came on my radar because he blew the cover off of a hoax in 1860 in Long Branch. Do you have I have like 90 seconds. I'll give you a quick summary. Okay, so as Henry Morford tells the story, and it's in Sprees and Splashes, he says, once upon a time, summer of 1860, everybody was in a hotel and they were bored. There were no customers. Nobody was coming in. There was a police chief down from New York who hated hearing all the bitching and moaning about no tourists. And he said, I'll bet you, meaning the hotel's owner, $50 that I can get this place packed in 24 hours. And $50 was a lot of money back then. So the hotel owner took him up on that. What the police chief did was get some local residents. They went to a local fisherman and paid him money to go off, I think they said, to Deal or Freehold and stay there overnight. They left his boat out behind the hotel. They then went to the local butchers and got a vat of pig blood, and then went to the local barber shop and got a bunch of hair, and taking a piece of wood from the hotel pile of wood, they staged a murder as if it happened. It was reported on the front page of the New York Times, and then circulated around the country because of the exchange system among newspapers in those days. Next day, it was revealed as a hoax.
How about that?
I am trying to figure out how Morford found out about it, and there are two possible explanations I'm working on. Number one, he worked in New York. He might have known the police chief who came down. Number two, for a period of time, Henry Morford's father was the Monmouth County coroner. And so there's a report in the paper about the coroner being called and trying to figure out what to do because there was no body.
Wow.
Next day, the fisherman came back and the hoax was revealed. So I found Henry Morford and Sprees and Splashes because I was looking for Long Branch.
He had a connection to Tammany Hall,
Yes,
and so the police, Tammany Hall ran the police.
yeah.
That might have been a connection.
Absolutely. He appears not to have been caught up in any of the scandals. He was just one of these people, you know, sometimes you see the House of Representatives and there's somebody up there who reads a bill aloud. That's basically what he did. He was a public reader. And so that's why I think he must have had training in public speaking.
How was he able not to get into the Civil War? Did he pay for an indulgence or anything? Because a lot of guys did.
Well, I think by that time he might have aged out and he was married and he had kids.
Okay.
So I think that's how he got out of it. Yeah, okay. Okay, sure.
Do you have any info on the early patent holder, Thomas Morford, and his son, Thomas? Thomas being of the Red Bank branch of Morfords.
No, I do not, but that sounds interesting. The Red Bank Morfords owned very valuable property on the waterfront, approximately where the Molly Pitcher Inn is now. Wouldn't surprise me at all. And I came across some records of cousins like being close with each other. And there's a lot of confusion over which branch of the family was in Red Bank and which was in Chanceville, because over the years they started to blend. The book that I found helpful on distinguishing those two branches is Mary Ann Kiernan, Kiernan, The Monmouth Patent.
Now, Tom, if I may, Brian, correct me on this, but I don't believe the Morford were involved with the patent. I mean, they were around soon thereafter, but I don't believe they were part of the actual patent.
No, I was giving you the name of Kiernan's book.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I know.
Right. Mhm. There's another question, well, more of a comment. This is Jim Morford. Let's see, he knew of Henry and has a first edition of Days of Shoddy. And he says, thank you for a most informative lecture about my distant relative.
Thank you. Keep the flame alive. I'm so glad that you have the novel and are preserving it. And as I said, historically, it's important because many of us have used the word shoddy in conversation, or you hear it used from time to time. And if you were looking for Henry Morford's national impact, it's sorry to say it's one word, but it is one word. So, and it's that one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he quotes from the novel. Yes, absolutely. That's how impactful it was. And it wasn't because Henry Morford was going rah, rah, rah about how wonderful the war was and how we should all get behind it. He was very critical of it. So in the Days of Shoddy, it's about this idea of planned obsolescence. The fact that military contractors were making a ton of money by cheating on the contracts and sending the troops garbage, and then the troops had difficulty performing in the field. So a less obvious aspect. See, a lot of times when people think about war literature, they're focused on battlefields and generals and movement of armies and things like that. But there's another aspect to war that can be called the home front, which is what does everybody else do who's not fighting? And that, I think, is Henry Morford's fiction's niche in American history. He did a great job writing about what was going on at the home front and how that was affecting troops in the field. So a harder subject, a less glamorous subject to write about, but historically speaking, an important one.
One final thing, so I think for everybody, I'm looking where it says C.H. Henry.
Mm-hmm.
The S.O.N. is, I don't know where we're sitting right now. Is that in Monmouth Road?
You're pretty close to it. We might be a little bit further north. If you look here, you'll see the Baptist Church and then W&C Morford right next to it. So if you're facing the front of the church, to your right-hand side was the Morford's lumber yard.
Coming down,
Mhm.
becomes, Middle Road?
Yes.
The old insurance, the insurance guy is still there, that old white house on the corner there.
Well, this is something that has bothered me. And I don't know what to make of it. One possibility is map accuracy between 1851 and 1861. And the later map is more accurate. Another possibility is William Morford may have fallen on hard times and moved. Because if you look closely at the 1861 map, the house on the corner is owned by D. Carroll. And William Morford's house is actually a short distance up Leonardville Road. Yeah, that's Church Street. So there's some confusion about where the general store was, and they say near the main intersection in town, but technically that was. Here again, if you're looking for where the Morford's store was, I believe that Jesse Hallenbake took it over.
Find the normalization after 8:45.
So this is 1861. Yep. And you can see Elias is still there. William is still there. Note the bend in the road. That's where his house is. But some of the Morfords have moved. I think it's Charles has given his farm to his son. I think it's John, who would have been, excuse me?
That would be.
No, that's, I think, Tyndall.
Yeah, that's Tyndall and that's Park Avenue going over where it says to store, but it goes down towards J something.
Yeah,
The one-
this one, yeah, this one here, that's,
That's Main Street going up. Right, okay.
Yeah. Oh, no, Church Street is the one that branches off to the, I'll tell you what, let's see, do I have it?
And that's Wilson Avenue over there. Now it is.
Yeah, Wilson, Church, Leonardville.
Valley Drive. That's-
During the Civil War, they still had the steamship, the basic side wheelers. So they were, it's country, but yet they were able to get to New York at a fairly decent time. It's like everybody's taking the ferry over. That was really pretty fast too, the side wheeler.
And there were a lot of options along
Yes.
the Bay Shore.
I don't know when the train came through, what year that was, but they did use the boats. They really have the steam engine really working pretty well.
Mhm. And they also had, particularly the New Jersey Central Railroad had a dual system. So they had a steamship terminal in Jersey City that would bring you to Sandy Hook. And then you would take the Jersey Central train from Sandy Hook down to Long Branch. My theory is that's a possible origin for the phrase going down the shore. Because literally you were going down the shore.
They used to have in the Highlands, even when I moved down here in the early 50s, they had what they call the camelback steam train. And it was the engineer sat right in the middle of the train, steam engine, and they had a small coal area, but they had at least 40 or 50, like they had tracks going out to the pier. And they would still have, they didn't have the old one, where the bicycle trail is now, they had to stick around. But in the early or mid 50s, they still had these camelback trains going back and forth to Jersey City. And then later on, they had what they call the bud cars, self-propelled single cars that would go to Matterhorn and back.
Carl, did you move here in the 1850s?
Almost. Yeah, I moved here 1950s. I moved where
Excuse me?
my parents. For the Veterans Day, they paid $12,000, Garden Parkway homes.
Yeah.
The first.
Sure.
Any comments, a great comment on it?
I'm sorry, just a second. We have a message in the chat. I currently live in the Hendrickson Morford home on Kings Highway, owned by, I believe, Henry's uncle Charles. If you are a resident related to the Morfords, I'm happy to have you over and share what I know. I also have a large blueprint from the sale of the house from the Morfords to the Flemings in the 1920s. It shows the original lot of land owned by Charles from Kings Highway to Van Pelt Insurance over to Middletown North and the home on Tyndall and Schwartzel Drive up to Kings Highway. Wow. My suggestion, just to go back to the beginning of the message, if you could scroll back. I am sorry to say that I am not a Middletown resident. And I'm not related to the Morfords. I just have a great deal of admiration and respect for Henry and his works. So my suggestion, and I really do appreciate this, would be to get in contact with Tom at the Middletown Township Historical Society and see what can be done in order to review and perhaps digitize or copy or preserve the information so it can be in more than one place. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Stanley Blair. That was excellent. I think we all really enjoyed this. You can visit our website for upcoming events that we have, middletownnjhistory.org. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.